Is this a good place to stand for the...
Yep.
Okay. All right, well, welcome everybody to the CPEP seminar today. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Brendan Kelly as our CPEP speaker today. And he fits the bill perfectly of a CPEP speaker because he has had a career full of both science and policy, specializing in the Arctic, but also the Antarctic too. He's been down there as well. Brendan is trained as a marine ecologist. He got his degrees from UC Santa Cruz, University of Alaska Fairbanks, where he's currently employed, and best of all, Purdue University. And, well, second best behind Wisconsin, right? And so Brendan will be talking today largely in his capacity as the Executive Director of SEARCH, which is an interdisciplinary Arctic research and collaboration program that we'll talk more about. And he has spent 2 stints at NSF as program manager, and most recently was an advisor with a science advisor within the Obama administration. So he's done lots of interesting things in his career, and he'll be telling us about some of those things. So, Brendan, it's all yours.
Thanks, Steve. So many years during the head-down period of my career, I spent every spring camped on the Arctic sea ice, studying the ecology of ice-associated animals. And of special interest was the most abundant of the Arctic marine mammals, ring seals. And that species inhabits all seasonally ice-covered seas and some freshwater lakes in the northern hemisphere. So other ice-associated seals depend on areas with natural openings in the ice. But ring seals have a single adaptation that allows them to occupy even areas of 100% ice cover. And that is that they have very thick claws on their front flippers with which they abrade holes through the ice and maintain those holes to breathe. They also use those claws to excavate snow caves above the breathing holes where the snow has drifted to sufficient depth. And it's in those snow caves that the young are born and nursed for the first couple of months of their lives. So studying that ecology and studying those snow caves, those layers, requires removing the part of the ceiling and a head-down posture, which you see here. The head-up portion of my career started with earlier failures of that snow cover that exposed young seals prematurely to extreme weather and to predators. It became necessary to collaborate with experts in ice and snow dynamics, with atmospheric scientists, with modelers, and others. And of course, I had collaborated previously in my research, but primarily with Inuit hunters, from whom I learned a great deal about the behavior and ecology of these ice-associated animals. Critically important to my research was learning from the Inuit how to use dogs to locate these holes beneath the snow cover. The Sikumiu, or the people of the sea ice, lived on the ice throughout the winter months and depended on ring seals for food, for fuel, and for skins from which they made clothing, ropes, and other materials. Their dogs showed them where to hunt. So the dog has located the smell of seal breathing under the snow. The hunter has probed to find exactly where that opening is. And now he's placed a little bit of bone into that probe hole to which he's frozen a single hair. And he's going to watch for that hair to start pulsing up and down, which tells him there's a seal breathing under the snow. This is how he feeds his family. Well, if there hadn't been a hunter there, the seal would have breathed and then gone back under the ice to forage for fish and plankton, and eventually surfaced, probably in another hole. Or certainly if he detected the hunter there, he would have gone to an alternative hole. Now he's surfaced in a hole that's inside of one of these snow caves excavated on top of the ice. Well, other predators, principally polar bears, also seek out ring seals. And in fact, 90% of what polar bears eat is ring seals. Thus, the species is both culturally and ecologically critical in the Arctic Ocean. Neither polar bears nor the Sikumi would have been able to colonize the Arctic without the presence of ring seals. So my initial research in ring seals focused on disturbance by on-ice industrial activities, but from there branched out to studies of under-ice navigation, predator avoidance, population dynamics, and eventually responses to climate change. The latter principally entailed the aforementioned increasingly early snowmelts and the head down phase. From field observations, we knew that ring seals need snow cover of 25 centimeters or more in order to create layers suitable for raising their offspring. And there we go. So basically, anything in the greens on up to the reds is deep enough snow cover. In the blues, the snow cover is insufficient for them to form layers. So we're looking at the snow cover on the Arctic Ocean in the last couple of decades of the previous century. Well, our data showed that starting in the 1990s, the snow was accumulating later and melting earlier. So when NOAA was petitioned to list ring seals under the Endangered Species Act, it became important to be able to forecast the future of snow cover on the Arctic sea ice. So working with Cecilia Bitz and Paul Hetzel at the other UW, we contrasted spring on-ice snow depth in the last century with forecasts of snow depths by the end of the current century, based on 10 models. And the models consistently forecast that by the end of this century, adequate snow cover will be lost from about 70% of the Arctic Ocean. And so this result was critical in the decision NOAA made to list this species under the Endangered Species Act, not because they're numerically depressed, but because their habitat is going away. But these models results were necessary but not sufficient to that NOAA decision. It also was necessary for the NOAA administrator, as well as for judges hearing subsequent court challenges, to fully appreciate the contribution and the connection between the seal's dependence on snow and the forecasts. So writing and briefing clearly were as important to the decision as were the data. Of course, mine were not the only field data into which the climate signal intruded. Researchers from many disciplines were becoming alarmed by the unexpected consequences of an Arctic warming 2 to 3 times as fast as the planet as a whole. And that alarm spawned conversations among diverse researchers and indigenous people. A very recurring theme of the conversations was the need to understand and predict future changes based on a whole Earth system perspective. We could not expect to inform the Inuit about the future of their resources without reliable information about snow cover change, which requires understanding atmospheric changes and their connections to oceanic changes, biogeochemical cycling, and a great many feedback processes. A lot of us were lifting our heads, and collaborative efforts to understand the changing Arctic were born or reinvigorated. One consequence is what I call the alphabet Arctic soup, or the Arctic alphabet soup, a plethora of scientific, governmental, and boundary organizations with values combining some combinations of A and I. One example is the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, comprising 15 federal agencies, each of which conducts research in the Arctic. In 2011, the National Science Foundation and the White House agreed that IARCtic needed to be reinvigorated, and I worked for the President's Science Advisor to herd the interagency effort. In 2013, we produced the first integrated federal Arctic research plan, and later that year, we produced the first ever U.S. national strategy for the Arctic. My job was keeping the President's Science Advisor up to date on polar science issues broadly. We worked on things like figuring out the balance between logistics support and direct science spending in Antarctica. Similarly with the Ocean Billing Program, and this perpetual challenge of how much logistics support do we provide and at what cost to paying salaries and paying investigators. But I also was broadly responsible for briefing on the developing understanding of environmental change in the Arctic. Well, those efforts required that I bridge the latest science concerning the changing Arctic with policymakers in regards to natural resource development and management, environmental quality, economics, and national security. So I want to emphasize 4 takeaways today for scientists who might be interested in informing policy with what you do. And here are my takeaways. Language is important. Bandwidth, not intelligence, is limiting to policymakers. Third, decisions have to be informed, which is not the same as being decided by science. And fourth, I come away realizing that we are very rich in scientific talent in this country. Language does matter. It seems ironic that in science, certain terms are used in narrow ways to ensure precision. Think about the way we use significant. Okay? But we also have a culture of sloppy shorthand. For example, too many presentations and publications refer to an ice-free Arctic in the coming decades. But in fact, none of our models are predicting an ice-free Arctic. What they do predict is that we will have a much reduced ice cover in winter. So we're talking sea ice here. Our sloppy shorthand therefore misses the fact that there will be winter sea ice, and that summer will be nearly ice-free, where nearly means 1 million square kilometers or less. So to put this in some perspective, in 2012, a senior scientist in the White House, a very accomplished physicist, asked, while Shell was drilling in the Chukchi Sea, "Brendan, I don't get it. Why is Shell having trouble with ice? I thought the Arctic ice was going away." Well, pictured here is a rig in less than 1 million square kilometers of ice. They got chased off by ice. It was a serious problem. Part exacerbated by our sloppy shorthand. My second point is that policymakers are not afforded the luxury that we are to specialize, but that does not mean they are not sophisticated thinkers. For example, Obama was interested in science and prone to ask a lot of questions of the science advisor. And one concerned a series of massive snowstorms along the eastern portion of the U.S. early in his presidency. So John Holdren, the science advisor, gave a concise description of a hypothesis that had recently been advanced by Steve Vavris and his colleagues, linking the snowstorms and other extreme events to diminishing sea ice cover. The president liked the concise explanation of how Arctic warming decreases the temperature and pressure gradients between latitudes, thereby weakening the jet stream, the meandering jet stream being responsible for sucking cold air down along the east coast in certain events. In fact, the president liked that explanation so much that he made Holder reprise it for all the senior presidential advisors. They, in turn, insisted that he turn it into a YouTube video that went out the same day. Holdren then turned to me as the polar science advisor and said, keep abreast of the developments of this hypothesis. Fortunately for me, Steve and his colleagues were meeting with their critics shortly thereafter to explore the differences. And what I learned at that meeting was that Jennifer Francis and Steve had put forward a plausible hypothesis supported by recent events, but critics pointed out other influences and insufficient observational record. So the take-home I delivered to Holdren was that the science community is doing exactly what they should do. And they were discussing their differences and then developing jointly a research program that would help them distinguish between alternative hypotheses. So I had to report back that the community is doing what it's doing, and it's going to take a while. And we just have to be patient and keep funding the work. The point, though, is that the president and most policymakers did not have the time or bandwidth for the detailed explanations about the science. But the president did need a concise, accurate, and sophisticated explanation. When advising on seals, I drew on my own research and head-down period, but advising on extreme weather events required translating the science from others. So I suggest that if we want to advise on environmental policy, we cannot expect to be experts in every area, but we do need to know enough to ask the right questions of the right people and to learn on the job. It's also important for us as scientists to recognize the difference between informing and dictating policy. One Saturday, I was summoned to the West Wing to discuss Arctic Ocean protections with John Podesta. I'd done my homework and was prepared to present what we knew about the ecological and culturally sensitive areas. When I arrived, already crowded into Podesta's office were colleagues from the Domestic Policy Office, the Council on Environmental Quality, and the National Security Council. It made sense. Informing and making decisions about withdrawals in the Arctic Ocean, withdrawals from oil development, needed to consider policies in all of those domains and not just from the Office of Science and Technology Policy. We were fortunate to have a lot of very smart, hardworking people working on those issues. We were also fortunate to have a wealth of talented scientists studying the Arctic, although I'm not sure what to make of the fact that over 60% of them talk with their hands. Well, regardless of the gesticulations, working at the science policy interface in the government left me convinced that observations and models have greatly advanced our understanding and predictive skills with respect to environmental change in the Arctic. Lagging behind, however, is our ability to effectively communicate what we know to decision makers. Given the rapid pace of unprecedented change in the Arctic, we must retool our communication strategies to bring our science to bear in timely and effective ways. So after the White House, I was attracted in particular to SEARCH, the study of environmental Arctic change, a multidisciplinary, multi-institutional collaboration among scientists studying environmental change in the Arctic. I took the role of executive director in 2015 because I saw the opportunity to help our talented research community advance whole system understanding through synthesis and to increase the speed and effectiveness of informing policy. This year, SEARCH produced a synthesis of the impacts of melting ice and thawing permafrost on society and ecosystems. Northern Hemisphere permafrost holds an estimated 1.5 trillion grams of carbon, about twice the amount that's in our current atmosphere. How much of that carbon will be released into the atmosphere is a crucial research question. I note that Susan Attali and co-workers recently published an estimate of 1,600 teragrams of carbon released per year from permafrost during the winter, exceeding the average growing season uptake. The aerial extent of Arctic sea ice in September is now declining by 13% per decade, contributing to increasing acceleration of coastal erosion in Siberia and Alaska, and of course, greatly enhancing the loss of reflective surface, a major positive feedback to Arctic warming. So, as a result, Arctic temperatures are now greater than they've been in at least 40,000 and probably more than 100,000 years. The resulting loss in volume of glaciers and ice sheets has tripled since 1990. And we now estimate conservatively that we'll lose a half to a meter, or we'll see a half to a meter increase in sea level rise, although some research, including going on in this institution, might suggest even higher rates. We published that synthesis in Earth Futures to make it broadly accessible. But again, we need to be cognizant of the bandwidth issue. Indeed, the lingua franca of policymaking are succinct briefs. So Search produces 1 to 2 page briefs written in accessible language by experts. Each brief addresses a policy-relevant question about Arctic environmental change in a format that's common to policy offices. The briefs and supporting literature are made available on the Search website under Arctic Answers. The supporting literature, arranged in increasing detail, is important to affirm the reliability of the briefs and to facilitate additional research by policy staff. Arctic Answers has proven to be popular. The journal Arctic, Antarctic, and Alpine Research has invited us to publish the series, and we have had multiple invitations from Congress to do in-person briefings as a result of Arctic Answers. Here you see a Senate staffer paging through Arctic Answers and Arctic researchers briefing the Senate's Arctic and Ocean caucuses. We found that the most effective format is to have a single presenter highlighting the major points and then having questions and answer and discussion with the scientists. It also has proven effective to eschew data slides and focus on photos that illustrate concepts that are difficult to envision if you're not familiar with Arctic landscapes or processes. This example of an eroding bluff near Fairbanks was especially helpful in describing the structure and dynamics of permafrost. A Search paper in Nature last year was picked up by Senator Murkowski. She's been a big supporter of these Arctic Answers. She saw this paper on permafrost and gaps in our understanding of the thaw and its implications, particularly for carbon cycling. And she reached out to us wanting to know what could she do to fill in these gaps. Well, there's both an opportunity and a peril there in that the senator interested in an area of research wanting to know what you do, take the call. So we had a very good call with her staff. But the peril was that we all recognize that making funding decisions based on one paper on one issue is not in the ultimate interest of the whole community. So we had to find this balance between appreciating her work and telling her what kinds of things broadly could support research without turning it into some kind of an earmark for a particular project. But that experience highlights the need that Search now sees for scientists to co-produce research with Indigenous people and policymakers. Indigenous people, because they often are experiencing and observing environmental change on the ground, and they have a deep traditional knowledge of the Arctic environment. Policymakers, because their ability to use research results is greatly impacted by how the research is framed and conducted. So as a step towards this co-production, SEARCH convened a conference, Arctic Futures 2050, at the National Academies of Science just 2 months ago. We brought together 400 Arctic scientists, Indigenous people, and policymakers from around the Arctic. Most of the presentations were panels comprising just 3 people, 8 scientists, an Indigenous person, and a policymaker. One of the speakers, however, could have been a panel by herself. Maya Lukin is Inupiat. She's an archaeologist, and she's a superintendent of 3 national parks in Alaska. Here are some excerpts from her remarks.
In an area of the world with no connecting roads, winter travel by sled dogs and snow machines happens every single day. We take the metro, we take a snow machine. Our area is about 38,000 square miles, mostly above the Arctic Circle. Within that area are 3 parks, 12 cities and villages connected by river, ocean, and overland traditional routes used by thousands of years. Both my uncles were lost when they traveled at a normal time in the spring to our camp, fell through the ice with their snow machines in gear, and never recovered their bodies. Last year, my cousin went hunting in places he had hunted safely for 30 years, and he never returned. And his snow machine was seen a week later submerged and frozen in place. And this April, a family member of mine went through the ice with her husband and 11-year-old niece. All prepared in a place where ice can always refuse to travel. Administratively, as superintendent, you have to take into consideration things like that. Overland winter travel is important to the Monument Arctic Reserve, and the cost to fly in remote Alaska is tremendous. But the uncertainty of the thickness of ice means a higher cost to those of us tasked with managing the land and ensuring the safety of our employees. To ensure that safety, we now have to pay for vendor flights, which we once could have easily safely traveled by snow machines to all 3 parks. And the cost difference to the public is approximately $3,200 per trip per person.
We worked all the panelists and speakers hard in advance of the conference, practicing so that their presentations were accessible to the diverse audience at the conference. For example, SEARCH's Scientific Steering Committee Chair, Marika Holland, clearly described how climate models work and their limitations.
At the end of the day, we have these comprehensive Earth system models. They include an ocean, an atmosphere, a sea ice, and a land component. These models started being developed in the 1970s, and they basically included those 4 components. We now also include ecosystems, a carbon cycle, chemistry, land ice. So we are continually improving and expanding these models. The models are designed to simulate the statistics of climate and not the events of a particular year. These are not weather models. And so if you ask me what the temperature in Shishmaref is going to be on January 1st, 2050, that's a question I cannot answer. I can't tell you what the envelope of likely temperatures is going to be, what an extreme warm day will look like, what an extreme cold day will look like. And I can tell you how that envelope of temperatures will shift compared to what we observe today. And the ultimate goal of these systems is to better understand the climate, to understand how the climate works. This is how they've been traditionally used. What we end up with at the end of responds. That's incredibly challenging to do from observations alone. So you might look at changes over the latter part of the 20th century and the fact that the climate has warmed. Well, during that time, greenhouse gases have increased. There have been changes in how much sunlight the Earth receives from the sun. There have been changes in volcanic emissions. How can we attribute that change to just one factor? It's very complicated to do from observations alone. These models give us a path forward to do that.
All of these talks are on the search website, and I encourage you to listen to the whole talk. But I will say that both the policymakers and the indigenous participants in the conference particularly appreciated the clarity of Marika's description of how climate models work and what their limitations and strengths are. So what does this all have to do with the revolution I referred to in my title? Well, in the structure of scientific revolutions, Thomas Kuhn pointed out that normal science is based on established paradigms and involves communications between experts, hence communications that assume a thorough knowledge of first principles. In contrast, Kuhn noted that those scientists establishing new paradigms were obliged to communicate with sophisticated but non-expert audiences. Hence, they used broadly accessible language. Think about Darwin, the origin of species. But those of us communicating normal science don't recapitulate first principles. Thus, we leave out audiences who have not read the same textbooks of our specific disciplines. Our scientific communication, thus, has evolved in ways that Kuhn believed to be too little studied, but whose modern end products are obvious to all and oppressive to many. So in this era of extreme environmental change, to say nothing of challenges to science's validity and importance, we need to reverse the process by which specialists communicate with increasingly narrow audiences. We need specialists to relearn how to write and speak to anyone interested in the topic, and not just to specialists within that field. Doing so in collaboration with indigenous people and with policymakers would represent the revolution necessary to bring our science to bear in timely and effective ways. We should all lift up our heads. Thanks.
Okay, we have plenty of time for questions.
You told us about the strong warming of the Arctic. Reminds me of something I discovered 40 years ago. The oceanic heat surplus of the Pacific flows through the South Atlantic northward across the equator into the North Atlantic. Can that be a major perpetrator?
Not to the net energy balance of the whole planet. It certainly is.
No, I mean of the Arctic.
Sure. I mean, that's part of the redistribution of heat. Yeah.
So that may be part of the culprit.
Well, I guess the question is that change in that there's more heat coming up into the Arctic from the Atlantic because of some just internal process, or is it driven by an external source?
Yeah.
Questions or comments from anyone?
I saw in the news today that there was an article in Bioscience that had 15,000 signatories to it that argued that we're in a climate emergency. I'm curious if you, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it was an update from, I guess, a 1992 article with 1,500 authors. Is that an effective communication strategy? Or do you think that that's, because it's a different approach, right? You're talking about policies and briefings and really bringing people together. Here's also the activism side of saying we need change now today. And where is the role as a scientist between those two different worlds?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
So when I got my degree, I didn't give away my citizenship. I still vote. I still, as a citizen, exercise my right to sign letters, to be an activist. But I don't do it wearing my university hat and my search hat. I don't use my university email to support campaigns. And I think that's an important distinction. Not all of my colleagues agree with me, but I think it is important because at the end of the day, we were having this discussion earlier today, we can support policymakers by sharing what we know as we know it, without putting our thumb on the scale saying, therefore you should exercise policy X or Y. If I walk into a congressional office and say, I really need you to shut down coal plants and here's why, I've just gone beyond my expertise. I can tell you a lot about the consequences of continuing to burn coal to the environment, to people's health, but the economics of it, political, social justice issues, those are outside of my area of expertise. So I think it makes sense to share what we know with everybody equally. It's the same answer no matter what party, no matter what industry I'm talking to. But we should share what we know clearly, we should make it available. That said, you know, we should also vote our conscience, we should decide what letters to sign, because we are at the end of the day also still citizens, parents, in some places, like examples, grandparents. But then the conversation we were talking about earlier today is, if we leave this policymakers to find out the answers to our current understanding to others, there are people who are very happy to fill that role, and they do every day, all day long. They're lobbyists for industry, and they're lobbyists for conservation groups. And they are professionals. They really know how to talk to policy staffers. They're really good at it. But they also each have their own political agenda. So I would argue that we are missing the opportunity, we're missing the responsibility as scientists to go in without an agenda, but with a clear, concise explanation of what it is we know currently. Is that?
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
It's clear that the pace of change in the Arctic and the rate at which people are experiencing this is alarming. At some point, the pace of the lived experience is faster than our ability to understand and prepare for it. Are we past that point yet? And what do you do with surprises?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where the risk assessment approach that I think we talked a bit earlier is quite helpful. Because in risk assessment, the way engineers practice it, they build in the possibility of surprises. And I only say that because I think, you know, we have to sort of think about what does that mean with the concept of a black swan. If you're trying to decide, am I going to try to save my village by armoring the coast, or are we going to move, or are we going to just hope for the best, et cetera. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, I think we've gotten into a bit of trouble with the concept of a tipping point. Because in a lot of policy discussions, particularly with the public, it quickly turns into, well, is it too late? As in, can I just buy that SUV and drive off to the sunset or not, you know? And it sort of leads people to, you know, ask the question, I get this question a lot, is it too late? Are we already beyond the point of no return? We're a lot worse off than we would have been if we had taken action 5 years ago, 10 years ago, et cetera. But I don't know that we should give up, right? I mean, I don't think my son is going to have as nice an environment. He's certainly not going to go out on the ice with me, or take his son out on the ice like I took him. But how much worse it's going to be for him and his family is another way of looking at it. Then was that kind of what you were getting at, or
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, the other side of that, though, is things are moving so fast in the Arctic that as we think of adaptation strategies, are communities able to conceptualize the speed at which they're moving? Meaning, you can imagine saying, okay, fine, we'll build some sort of a barrier for erosion, but that barrier is going to last 10 years, and they're going to have to move anyway. Is the pace just seems so fast that it's hard to conceptualize?
I think that's a real problem, and I worry about how much money is New York prepared to spend, or the federal government to spend to keep Manhattan above sea level. That could be, there's a lot of bad decisions ahead of us, I'm sure. So I think the importance is that, every one of us needs to take some incremental steps to increase the sophistication of the conversation. So people go beyond saying, is it too late or not, as if it's a binary choice, and saying, well, how bad is it going to be? And what's a logical solution? What's a train that's just not a good one to be on? But that's a level of education that, frankly, our electorate doesn't seem to have. And so, we're focused on trying to get people over being denialists. And we really need to be getting people not only beyond being denialists, but being able to ask good questions and to kind of think through, well, is armoring really the choice here? Is that sufficient? Or shooting aerosols into the atmosphere? There are lots of different approaches you can take. Yeah, I don't have a magic bullet other than that the kinds of questions I could get asked, even at high policy levels, and sort of like, whoa, okay, wait a minute, there's a lot of understanding of the, sea ice present in shells drilling in the sea is not a binary choice here. And so that was sort of an aha moment for me. It's not just outreach education, I need to do inreach education. I had to work with the people right around me who, very smart people, they'd just never seen sea ice. And they just didn't have any sense of its dynamic nature.
I'm curious to know if you know much about the current status of the polar bear population that was once seen as a keystone species, and with the loss of ice that polar bear numbers were going to dwindle, but it seems like there's evidence that they're adapting and spending more time on land, and so it's an interesting problem in that climate activists have to kind of backtrack a bit on that one. But what is actually going on with the polar bears as far as we know?
Yeah, so we think there's roughly 19 semi-discrete populations of polar bears, and so they're managed that way as though they were 19 subpopulations. Some of which are increasing, none of them particularly fast, several of which are stable, and some of which are plummeting, particularly the ones that are forced to spend more and more time on land. Hudson Bay being a perfect example. So as the ice trees in Hudson Bay has shrunk from both ends, those bears are adapted to spending the summer months out on the sea ice, and they come ashore in the fall again, in the spring, and then they go back out again. Well, they're ending up spending longer and longer periods of time on land than they're starting to do. So what people call adaptation, you have to be very careful. And some people will say, oh look, they changed their behavior, they're adapted. Well, often that change in behavior is making the best of a bad situation and now occupying a suboptimal habitat. That's a particularly extreme example because those animals, as I said, really depend on seals to sustain them. So those bears that are stuck for a long time on land are eating grass, and they're eating birds, and they're literally starving to eat. So I think it's not going to play out real fast, but it's sort of like the ring seal. We have the same criticism. There's lots of ring seals in the world. It's probably the most abundant seal on the earth. And people say, well, how could you list these as threatened if there's so many of them? And I say, well, it'd be sort of like if you came along in 1840 and said, there's tons of bison, let's roll up the plains, right? It's like we've literally taken the habitat of one another. So, yeah.
Passenger pigeons too.
Yeah.
Back.
So it seems that you were saying that scientists should do more outreach or speak more to the average citizen so people are more informed. Is that what you're saying? And if so, how would they do it?
So, yeah, I guess I'm making a broad appeal that as scientists, we ought to really ask ourselves, is it adequate to publish specialized papers in peer-reviewed journals, or do we need to go farther? Do we need to be an active part of that being accessible to policymakers, and particularly in a more reasonable timeline? What that means for individuals, I wouldn't go so far as to say every individual scientist needs to go do more outreach. I have to be very careful to say that we have colleagues, thank God, who are asocial, unable to talk to anybody in the public, doing fabulous science, which we really can. And I wouldn't suggest we change that. But I would suggest that for those people who are able to lift their head up from their bench or their seal hole, whatever it is they focus on, that they do so, because it's an emergency. It is a climate emergency. And the change, as I said, is happening so rapidly that if we wait to solidify every scientific result, we'll be left out of the discussion. There will be others that will answer the policy questions in our stead.
So what would be examples of some things that they should do?
So I think the examples are that, and it's not just scientists, I think everybody needs to figure out where they can add benefit to the conversation. So for some people, it's going to be, working in policy shops. For other people, it's going to be advising politicians. For other people, it might be writing letters, supporting the kind of letter that was described earlier. Maybe for other people, it's just challenging Uncle Fred with Thanksgiving dinner with some real data. So I resist sort of the idea that, there's sort of a formula here. I just think we should all figure out what could I do? What skills, what interests, what time, what passion do I have? Where can I help make this a more nuanced conversation societally?
Just a quick follow-up on that is that, and as part of that, I think training scientists with those tools, because I don't think traditionally our training has that. So I think that I fully agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. It's a big part's our educational system, and I don't know what the right balance is, because this hyper specialization that many of us have seen change a lot in the length of our careers has produced some fabulous science and technology. It's great, but I'm not sure it's as appropriate for the emergency we're in now. I sometimes think of it as if you woke up tomorrow and somebody said, hey, there's a meteor coming at us really fast. You probably wouldn't respond by saying, that's great, I'm going to get a PhD student and get them working on that, and maybe in 5-6 years we'll have some data. That's probably not quite the right response. So this isn't quite a meteor coming at us in the sense that it'll be here in some finite amount of time, which we can calculate, but it is unprecedented change happening really rapidly, and the pace with which science informs policy, I would argue, isn't up to that challenge. Yes?
You touched on communication between communities. Reminds me of an environmentalist type lecture, but it was in a business school. And there the concept of risk came up.
Right.
And it really meant very different things. For
Yeah.
half the population it was in dollars,
Right.
and the others that meant sort of really something of what goes on in the floor and
Yeah.
the environment,
Right.
the nature.
You're absolutely right. Our ability to think in multiple currencies is very limited, much less how do you optimize on multiple currencies at the same time? This is where, asking a scientist, so I've been asked in Senate testimony, okay, you presented this really interesting data, this is really helpful, what should we, meaning the Senate, do? And my response was, be careful who you ask. I'm a scientist. I can tell you about those consequences that I know about, but you have a hard job as the policymaker trying to optimize over a whole bunch of axes at once. And so it's easy to get sucked into saying, well, I'm a scientist, therefore I know the right answer. No, I just know part of the right answer.
I was wondering if you wanted to become more active in communicating, what are the channels or places that you go to find policymakers in particular who might be interested in what you know?
So I don't know if everybody heard that. The question is, in terms of the challenge of communicating what we know to policymakers, the question is, what policymakers would be interested in hearing this? How do you find them? So most policymakers are very keen to hear from their constituents. They're used to kind of, this is a vastly oversimplification, but they're really used to two kinds of visiting. I'm just Joe Q. citizen, I just want to go into my congressional office or my state legislature or whatever it is, and opine about things that matter. They take those meetings gladly, keep a record of it. But then they also get more professional contacts from people who know exactly how to do those meetings, exactly how to lead just the right message. You typically see this from people in the lobby industry. And that's no pejorative, that's people's real job. And they might represent an industry, they might represent a special interest to be a conservation organization, but they really have it down. What they're not so used to, unless they've sought out an expert to testify for a particular area or something, is people who come in who do have specialized knowledge, but have no agenda, right? They come in and say, if it's useful to you, we can tell you. And this relationship with the Alaska delegation in particular, but other people in Congress who care about climate issues, we've had to develop over time to help them understand that, and once they get it, they really appreciate it. They really, I mean, we were talking about the National Council for Science and the Environment. One of my colleagues with that organization told me sometime last year that she was in Senator Murkowski's office, and she asked the senator, so where do you guys in your office get your scientific information about changing Arctic? And the staffer said, oh, that's easy, we just go to search. And that was great to hear, but it took a lot of time and effort to kind of establish that we are responsive, we know what we're talking about, and we will find them the right person to answer any sort of Arctic question they might bring up. I'm suggesting that's the kind of thing, that's one thing that we could all do. You don't have to be an Arctic scientist, obviously, to do that. So I think they're there. What's just unusual is they're just kind of used to those other kinds of visitors who are just there to adapt or to push a particular agenda. So that's why at the conference we brought in policymakers to the conversation as well, because I think they kind of need to figure out, okay, if we're going to collaborate, just like any collaboration, they're going to figure out their side. Two more questions.
So it sounds like you're mostly talking about those policymakers that are willing to engage. How do you deal with the skeptics that are not? You talked about
Go to my office.
as an academic or scientist.
Respectfully. I mean, that's all we can do is just, this isn't personal. Realistically, I remember
back to first principles. Is that?
Yeah,
is that
ultimately, if I really thought I was going to try to bring somebody like that over, you invest a lot of time. You start with what is it that we share in common? What is it that you and I believe in value and important? Often, almost everybody has kids and grandkids, and nobody likes the idea that we're going to leave a really shitty environment. So that can be a good place to start. But that's a big long-term project. I will say, one of those Senate testimonies you were thinking about a moment ago, Joe Lieberman was in the Senate, he was chairing a committee on climate change impacts on wildlife. I was one of several witnesses, and Senator Inhofe was on the committee. And the staff, from Lieberman's staff, just made it very clear to us at that. Said, look, Senator Inhofe will just bait you, he'll just try to distract, he'll try to deny. Don't take the bait, don't spend any energy trying to be respectful, but we're really focused on John Warner, who's on the fence about climate change. So partly it's strategic, knowing, when's the time. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question. How do we deal with people who just are invested in not believing this could possibly be true? That's a huge task. I just start with respect and confidence.
Last question?
Yeah, so in the tropical and temperate zone, it's a little more straightforward as to how to mitigate these kind of problems. So like if there's habitat loss, you plant more trees. If there's a species that's facing some sort of, if it's endangered, you have some sort of idea as to what to do to mitigate that threat. But at like in the Arctic, like I myself don't have a lot of understanding as to how things work over there. So I want to know what the community or citizen level dialogue is over there as to how to mitigate climate change, or like you mentioned the ring seals at the start of your talk. Do they feel a general sense of helplessness because it's just ice and it's just going to decrease and there's nothing you can do about it? Or like what exactly is the dialogue there, and what do they feel they can do? Is it only voting, or how does it work?
So you're talking about the people who live in the Arctic?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah. That's interesting, because most people who actually live in the Arctic, regardless of their feelings about the environment generally or their politics, they have no doubt that change is dramatic and serious. They experience severe fires, they experience in coastal erosion, they experience it in flooding events, they experience it in ecosystem, it just goes on and on, right? I think I don't know. It's interesting. Someone had those people together at the National Academies in September. I remember a Sami woman, a reindeer herder, and she was talking just very matter-of-factly. She understood the ecosystem changes and what impacts it was having on the reindeer. She also understood what the industrial effects were having, and she was just kind of having pragmatic conversations with her government about what they could do to ameliorate change. I think a lot of people in Alaska that I talk to are increasingly feeling, they've shifted. I was telling Steve earlier, from just a few years ago, the conversation would often go something like, hey, we just have this projection on sea ice, and your community is not going to have the same access to walrus that it used to, et cetera. And we would get some pushback from them, the gist of which was, you can tell me about what changes you see coming in the environment, but don't tell me about how we're going to respond. Like, we are resilient, we've been here a long time, we will adapt. Fair enough, I get it. The last 2 winters, we have not had sea ice in the northern Bering Sea. Nobody saw that coming. In the wintertime, I'm talking, not the summertime. Lots of pretty dramatic responses in the ecosystem that we can see, massive seabird die-offs. I could go on and on. Now I'm getting a very different kind of call from people in the communities in that region, which is, you can just hear the anxiety in people's voices. So I don't know which I like better, people sort of being semi-denial or people being truly despondent. New ways is a challenge. But I don't know, there's 4 million people live in the Arctic, and I come into that with a small faction of there's diversity things. So take that with a grain of salt.
Thank you, Brendan. And before we depart, and thank Brendan one more time, I want to announce that we'll be having an informal reception across the street at Union South over at the set, so please join us. And if there's other questions or comments you'd like to share with Brendan or others, please come along. So it'll be happening right after this. So thank you once again.